Hi, in today's tutorial I'll be introducing you to Blender's interface and covering some of its most basic features and tools. This tutorial is for beginners. In this introduction tutorial, I'll share some insights and tips I wish I'd known when I was starting out. This tutorial was recorded in Blender 4.1, but you can follow along in 4.2 as well, since all the tools we use remain the same. Let's start. This video serves as an introduction to the first tutorial. Unless you have Blender installed already, you will need to go to this address here, blender.org, click on Download, choose the version you want to install, for me that's Windows, and the download should start automatically. I'll just cancel the download because I already have it installed. Once the file is downloaded, go ahead and install Blender. The very first time you run Blender, you will get this quick setup. Choose Select with Left, spacebar Search, Save New Settings. You will have to do this only on the first run, but you can adjust everything later on. Usually you would choose General for modeling projects. When opening Blender, you start with 4 windows by default. The 3D viewport, where you can see the objects in the virtual 3D world. Outliner, a list of objects in the scene, also where you organize them. Properties, some of these affect the scene and some individual objects. Timeline, here we can find the changes we make in our scene through time. So this is used for animation. It is the time dimension added to the tree in 3D. X, Y, and Z are spatial dimensions, and then we add time for animation. But more on that later on. You can see all the keyboard keys and mouse buttons I'm pressing down here in the corner. One thing I like to do is go over here and in the gizmos drop-down menu, choose this move gizmo, which now gives me these arrows, and whichever object I click on now automatically gets these arrows showing the axes. So let's try some of the most basic commands. Move. We can move objects in Blender in a few different ways. To select an object, left-click on it in the 3D viewport, and then you can choose the command Move. Alternatively, I can press G, which is the shortcut for Move, and I get the same command. You will have to left-click in order to drop the cube, and if you want to cancel the movement, you can right-click. So let's do Ctrl-Z, which is undo. This brings the cube back to its original position. And if I move it somewhere without left-clicking, I can right-click and this snaps it back into place. So the right-click is cancel. Now let's try to move the object along one of the axes, X, Y, or Z. X, Y, and Z are the spatial dimensions, or axes. If I hit G and X, I isolate the movement only to the X-axis. I can move it left or right, but only along that line. Right-click, and this snaps it back into place. If I hit G, X, 2, Enter, I move the cube 2 meters to the right, or into the positive X-axis direction. Ctrl-Z for undo, and let's try to the negative. Now hit G, X, -2, Enter. Now I moved it 2 meters to the left, or into the negative direction of the X-axis. left-click on the cube to select it, and press R. Now you can see we're rotating the cube, but it's a free rotation. We are rotating from this view that we are in. If I press and hold down the scroll and move my mouse to the right or left, I pan around this object. So you can see from whichever angle we're looking at the cube and pressing R, we are rotating from this view. So this rotation is not very precise. Same as with moving the object, we can isolate the rotation to a certain axis. So let's try. Select the cube, press R, Z, type in 45 and enter. Now you rotated the cube 45 degrees on the Z axis. Ctrl Z to undo. Let's duplicate this cube. The command for duplicate is Shift D. If I hit Shift D while the cube is selected, I get another cube and it automatically goes into move. So once you duplicate an object, you have to place it somewhere. If you want to keep it exactly where the original object is, just cancel the movement with right-click. This places the cube exactly where the original one is. And we don't really know which one we're seeing because they're exactly in the same place. So it's a good idea to either move it or not forget that it's there. Because double geometry in the same space can cause problems with texturing later on. So let's just click and we will select one of the cubes, it's not important which one, and press GX3. So now we have two cubes in different locations. If I click over here on item, we can see the location of the objects. So you can see these two cubes have the same location except on the x-axis. Y and Z are the same. Shading. Shading is how we see the objects in the 3D viewport. We can either choose wireframe. Here we can see the actual geometry of objects. It is useful if we have objects inside each other. Solid. Here we can see the shape, but we don't see if there's something inside of this object. However, we can toggle this X-ray option here, which allows us to see through it. But I like to keep that off unless I need it. Material preview. Here we can see the materials without the light of the scene affecting it. So this is for material adjustments only. This is not how your render will look. Render view. This is a preview of how your image will actually look after rendering. Let's give it a try. To go into camera view, to actually see the angle you will take the render from, or take the image in the virtual space from, press 0. Pressing 0 takes you into camera view. F12 is shortcut for render image. You may see what the render looks like with this most basic setup. Here you can choose to save the image. A render is the resulting image of the computer's calculation of how the light behaves in the virtual 3D scene. If we turn on the render view now, we can move the light and see how it affects the cube. So select the light, hit G, and move it around. You can see the shadows change on the cube. If I press and hold scroll, I can rotate around. If I shift click and hold the scroll, I pan left or right. Try moving around a little. You can see our view is centered on the world origin right now. The world origin is where all of the axes are at 0, X, Y, and Z. and this is the middle point right there. I can choose the cube and hit H, which is the shortcut for hide. Alt-H unhides everything. So hit Alt-H to bring the cube back. And right now we are rotating around the cube because it is at the world origin point. If I want to focus on the light and rotate around it, I will hit the dot or period key on the numpad. If I rotate around now, you can see we're rotating around the light. Choose the camera, press the dot. Now we're focused on the camera. Zoom out by scrolling out. Select the cube, dot on the numpad. Now we're back to focusing on the cube. In the outliner, you can see the objects in your scene in different collections or folders. Here they're called collections, but I always refer to them as folders, so if I say folder sometimes, for the outliner, I mean collection. You may add new ones, rearrange, rename them as you please, just like folders. And remember, it's really important to stay organized, so use the collections and name them accordingly. You can turn whole collections on or off. This can make them invisible in the viewport or in the render. You may toggle the visibility in the viewport or renders for either the whole collections or separate objects. Let's try this. Select one of the cubes and turn off the visibility in renders. Now hit F12. As you can see, only one cube is visible. Although we see it in the scene, since we turned it off in the renders, it's not showing up in the render. Alternatively, we can keep it off in the viewport, but still have it visible in the render. Properties. The properties are where we adjust everything about our scene and the objects in it, like the materials, modifiers, which are some extra effects we add to objects, particle systems, individual object properties, simulation properties, hair systems, render output settings, color properties, etc. This can all seem overwhelming at first, but as we progress, you will learn about each of these and see how they can be used for different purposes. You will not use all of these settings for each project, but it's important you know what they do approximately so you know where to look when you need them. Some things are used more frequently than others, and in the long run, what you use will depend entirely on what you end up doing. You can do a bunch of different things in Blender. Let's go through some of these really quick. Some of them are for adjusting the scene, and some of them are for adjusting objects. Different types of objects have different settings, so you might see some of the options only for certain types of objects. For example, the cube has different settings than the camera, because they're totally different kinds of objects in the scene. In the render settings, you adjust the rendering engine. Blender has two rendering engines by default. Eevee, a real-time rendering engine, much faster, but less realistic by default, although it can be tweaked to look quite amazing. And there is Cycles, which is a ray tracing, meaning light ray calculating engine, that produces much more realistic renders. Cycles requires more computing power to work. Here in sampling, you adjust the quality of the renders, or how much the PC will calculate the light bounces. More calculation means longer renders, but better quality. The colors are adjusted here in color management, and more on the rest of it later. Output. Output is where you define the resolution, format, and the location where you want to save your file. View layer. View layer allows you to adjust the scene and compositing or after render editing options. Let's not get into all of this yet. Scene. Here you adjust the settings like the units, active camera, and some other options. World. Here you can adjust the world lighting, more on that later. Object. In the object properties we can define many parameters for each object in the scene. Modifiers. Modifiers are effects or changes we add to objects. These are important and we will be using them a lot. Particles. Particles allow you to add different particle systems. For example, you can use the hair type emitter for hair or grass on a field, and you might use the emitter particles as rain or snow. In physics, you add simulation to objects like water, fire, smoke, cloth, or collisions of different objects. Simulations are generally quite demanding for PCs. We will get into those soon enough. Constraints. Constraints add certain rules to objects and are very useful in certain cases. For example, you can make an object follow a defined path, or it can stay rotated facing another object as it moves around. Object data properties. This allows us to control an object's shape or the way it's textured. We need to cover other topics before going too deep into these. Materials. Materials are where the object's color and material are set. The original or default cube came with a default material already applied, so here I'm just removing it from both cubes by clicking on this little minus symbol. Texture properties. Texture properties allow us to add textures for certain uses. More on the difference between materials and textures later on. For now, let's stay in Eevee. Select one of the cubes and go to Materials. Let's give it a new material and rename it to Cube 1. Let's give it a blue color here. Now if I go into Render View, I can see I changed one of the colors. Now select the other cube. Now I can either give this cube a new material or copy the material from this first one. Let's try to copy the material. Left click on the cube without a material, hold down Shift and select the blue one. Hit Ctrl L, and this gives us an option of what we can copy from the active object onto the one we selected first. The active object is always the one we selected last. As we want the material, select Link Materials. Now these two cubes share the same material. If we select them, here in the material settings, you can see a little number 2. This means that this material is being used on two different objects, two separate objects. Now I can either delete this material from one of the cubes and give it a new material, or if I click on this number 2, it actually creates a copy of the same material. So now I can adjust one of them. Let's make this one red. Just like the collections, it's a good idea to keep the materials organized. Name them accordingly. Timeline. As the name suggests, the timeline is where we can see what changes we make to objects over time. This is what animation is: changes to objects through time, as time is the dimension we add to still 3D images to make them into animations. There is a lot of work to do on mastering the still renders before we start animating, but let's set up a simple animation now. Let's make these cubes loop up and down. For now, just follow along and we will do more animating later on. Extend the timeline a bit like this. Hover your mouse between the two windows until these arrows appear and then just pull it up a bit. The numbers you see here are frames. So right now our animation is set to be 250 frames long. Let's bring it down to 30. So click here and write in 30, enter. Then click the scroll and drag this to the center. Now if you zoom in, let's try to fill the whole timeline with the frames we have selected. Go to Item, let's start with this cube on the left. We will only be animating the up and down movement. This means we will only animate the location on the Z axis. You can see if I click and drag here, I am moving the cube up and down only along the Z axis. I can also click here, write 0, enter, and this places it at the world origin. On frame 1, click on this cube, press G, Z, and pull it down a bit. It doesn't have to be precise. You can see we're getting a few decimals here, but right now it's not important. Just bring it down. Select the other cube by left-clicking on it, G, Z, and pull it up. Also, it doesn't have to be precise. Now, since we want this animation to loop, what we need to do is have the location same on the first and the last frame. In order to tell Blender that we want these cubes positioned here on the first frame, we need to add keyframes. Keyframes lock values to certain frames. So now we want to lock the cube's location on the Z axis onto frame 1. We do it like this. Select the cube, hover the mouse over the Z axis and hit I. I is the shortcut for Insert Keyframe. Select the other cube and do the same thing. You can see when we add keyframes, this turns yellow. And also on the timeline, you can see we get this little yellow dot. If I click somewhere else, it disappears. So on the timeline, we can see the keyframes for the selected objects. If I want to see all the keyframes, I can press A in Viewport, and this selects everything in the scene. Alt-A deselects everything. Now I can either move this blue bar over to frame 30 by dragging it there and dropping it, or I can just click on frame 30. And you can fine adjust it here. This number here tells you the location of this blue bar, which is the active frame. Now both of these cubes have the keyframe on the first frame, but don't have it on the 30th frame. I need to get the same keyframe onto frame 30. I can do this two ways. I can either do it the same as first time, hover over the value and hit I. And let's do the second one differently. I can select it. If I click somewhere else on the timeline, you can see this dot is no longer yellow because it's not selected. If I click on it, it turns yellow. I can duplicate it with Shift D and it's automatically moving, same as in the viewport. I can drag it over to frame 30 and left click. Now for both objects, we get this orange line from keyframe to keyframe. This means there are no changes. So for now, there are no changes and there is no movement. There is no animation. Let's go to frame 15, which is right in the middle. Select the lower cube, G, Z, move it up. Hover over Z and press I to add a new keyframe. Select the second cube, G, Z, pull it down, and do the same thing. Hover over Z and hit I. Now let's go to the beginning and press play. There you go, you created your first animation. Since the first and last frames are the same, we get a perfect loop. I hope this tutorial helped you get started with Blender. To get most out of it, watch it again. If you have any questions, drop them in the comments and I'll do my best to answer. Keep an eye out for my new tutorial series, it's coming out soon. It's being recorded in Blender 4.2 LTS, which stands for long-term support version, and that will be the best way to start. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. Bye for now.